Looking at these images, could you believe that these are images of Japan? And on the other hand, what if I told you that these people are more feared than the Yakuza themselves? I'm Naka, and this is Japatonic. And today we're going to talk about the extreme left, the extreme right, and their relationship with the Mafia. Well, first of all, when World War II ended, Japan had its conflicts between socialism and nationalism. And there were some pretty extreme groups. Obviously, Japan after the war was a pretty chaotic country with a lot of political instability. But basically, Japan was already becoming an ally of the United States, which the far left opposed. Japanese socialism disagreed because they didn't want Japan to be a puppet of the United States, but they did want to have a close relationship with China. What's more, in 1960, there's a photo that many of you may have seen. It's actually the leader of Japanese socialism, who was assassinated by a 17-year-old young man who belonged to the Japanese far right. Well, many say that's what eliminated socialism in Japan. It doesn't go that far. Actually, no. Neither yes nor no. Actually, that assassination was more than anything, mainly symbolic. The right wing wanted to show that the Japanese people didn't want socialism. But that leader who was assassinated had even met and taken a photo with Mao Zedong. But anyway, the thing is that the left was never that powerful, so to speak. After the Olympics in Japan, they realized that Tokyo needed a bigger airport, and Haneda Airport in Tokyo had become too small. And that's when they planned the construction of the airport of Narita. Most people arriving in Japan land at Narita, since it's the larger airport. Well, at the end of the 60s, it was announced that the airport was going to be built. But what happened? The place where they wanted to build the airport was a rural area, where there were many farmers who were using the land, and the government forced the farmers to sell their land in order to build the airport. But what happened? The farmers obviously wanted to defend the land that was left to them by their parents, their grandparents, and their great-grandparents, where they had always worked. And that's when... What bad weather! That's when the Socialist Party joins in. So, basically, the entire far left, which included students and some diplomats, joined the peasants to put up resistance. And when 1970 and 1971 came, when the whole construction, logging, and all those things were really about to start, that's when there was extremely violent resistance. And it's one of the most violent protest cases in the contemporary history of Japan. They even built wooden forts and wooden watchtowers. I mean, everything was precarious, very improvised, but quite large. You saw country people throwing Molotov cocktails at tractors driven by the police. It was complete chaos. But obviously, the airport began its construction because, since these were not very formal organizations, they basically ended up losing. There were many deaths, but even so, the airport went into construction. The airport was supposed to open in 1972, but it only opened in 1978 because there was a 6-year delay. Because of all these protests, because of the resistance, and when they inaugurated the airport, it could only be done with one runway because, of course, the resistance, even though they had built the airport, was still there. And in the 80s, they wanted to move on to Phase 2 to complete the airport. And was the resistance going to let them? Obviously not. In the city of Narita, there was a protest, in which it said that the official numbers aren't on the civilian side, but there were more than 9,000 riot police at that event. And there, if you look at footage from that time, you see people, civilians wearing helmets, with their faces covered, carrying huge logs to break through the police, and things like that. These are scenes that don't really look like Japan. Also, I'm not sure if any of you have seen the anime movie Akira. It's a movie from '88, but before that, there was already the manga, the comic. And the fact is that within the first half of the movie, there's actually a scene with protests. Akira is supposed to be a futuristic cyberpunk movie. And you might ask, but what kind of future? Pessimistic? Not really. Actually, the movie was pretty much reflecting the reality of Japan in the 80s. That's what it was. It's not that things are so bad in the future, it's that we're still the same. That was the message of that scene in the movie. But it's exactly the same style of protesters. People with helmets, goggles, and their faces covered with scarves against the riot police. But obviously, the airport ended up just as planned, with its delays. What happened to the far left? Well, partly, by that time, the peasants they were fighting for were already very old, and many had already passed away due to age. And the government also tried to put a lot of pressure on them. They started arresting the leaders, and in case they didn't have any specific crime to imprison them for, then they put them on blacklists, where they couldn't get jobs at major companies or even many medium-sized ones. Because, of course, the left didn't have a big sponsor who could support them. Instead, they were all just working-class people, and basically, in the 90s, they started to fade away. Does it still exist? Yes. Because it's a democracy, anyone can be right-wing or left-wing. You can belong to an extremist party from either side freely. But it's very weakened. Even today, in Parliament, there is the Japanese Communist Party. But of course, out of the 800 members in the Diet, there are barely fewer than 10 in the entire Parliament. So they don't have a very strong voice, but it exists. But on the other hand, there's the Japanese nationalist far right, which is called Uyoku, meaning to the right, and on the left, it would be Sayoku. The Uyoku is basically an ultra-nationalist, militarist, and conservative group, with ties to the Yakuza, basically since it has existed. But the fact is that the goals of the far right after the war and today have changed quite a lot. Initially, racism or xenophobia wasn't even an issue, though they're now defining features. One could say that after World War II, the ultranationalists must be very offended by and opposed to the Americans. But no, that was the left. The right wanted to support the United States because for them, the enemy was the communists, the complete opposite of the left. When the Cold War ended, it was only then that communism had already lost much of its power. And that's when they had to look for new enemies. Basically, a bit against the United States and foreigners in general, with a strong focus on the Chinese and Koreans, since they were the largest immigrant groups at that time. Also, the left is basically not very visible. No one goes out with helmets and covered faces anymore, and if there is, we won't know about it. Why? Because the government also censors the left. If they protest, it gets no media coverage. Precisely so as not to encourage people who agree with leftist ideas. On the other hand, the right, even though they're not on television, doesn't get much space in the media either. Because it's not like they're making any special moves either. Yes, they are people you might run into on the street. And the truth is, I've run into the black trucks where they are several times, the trucks where they do their propaganda. It's called Gai Sheng Sha, which would be something like an urban propaganda vehicle, something like that. And well, when you run into them, that's exactly when they're performing and doing what they do best, which is propaganda. Nowadays, they often use a lot of slogans like with the issue of immigrants, saying that the country has to be like it was before. You see, they're also against Article 9 of the Pacifist Constitution, which says that Japan can't have a full military. It can only have self-defense forces. They want the Constitution to be changed. And on the other hand, they long for Japan to have the emperor as the main figure of government again.
Long live His Majesty the Emperor! Long live!
They're not politicians or from a party, just activists, right? And what they do is basically spread propaganda and at the same time recruit people if anyone wants to be part of them. They support themselves with memberships, correct? You pay to join, even though most already have jobs, right? They're members with jobs who pay dues, and many leaders also have their own jobs. Although it's said that there are up to 1,000 far-right organizations. Now, when you say far-right, maybe many people have seen in the news about the Sanseito, which is like the far-right political party. But the fact is that there's no evidence that this political party is connected to these activists. Maybe There is probably some connection, but it's in the shadows. The fact is that the Yakuza Mafia, which everyone knows, and maybe many people know their criminal organizations, are very nationalist and traditionalist. And the fact is that they used Uyaku, the right wing, as their political hand. The Mafia and the right wing have always shared similar ways of thinking. They were very similar, and they used them precisely as a political hand, let's say, right? Many times the Yakuza financed far-right movements. Although, ironically, many people say they're more afraid of the far right than of the Mafia itself. On one hand, it's mostly because of conspiracy theories, since there are many legends about the Uyaku. For example, it's said that the Uyaku was founded by ex-samurai millionaire families. This is my favorite conspiracy theory. Very interesting. But I've heard it from Japanese people, and honestly, it doesn't make sense, but it's good. They say that the Emperor of Japan was going to be executed, okay? That there was a plan to put him on trial and have him executed. But the far right that was forming at that time, as it was forming, look, all of Japan was destroyed. The brands, the companies were way down. But the billionaire families who used to belong to wealthy samurai families, they say that together with the far right, they bribed the American army. Well, they bribed the United States to keep the emperor alive. And that's why nowadays they are almost untouchable, like they can do whatever they want. And actually, what they say is that the far right is the one that really controls the Japanese mafia. Because they're not officially declared as mafias, but they can do whatever they want. Look, I know it doesn't make much sense, don't try to figure it out either. But these are conspiracy theories that honestly sounded really interesting to me. And, well, continuing with the question of why people are more afraid. In fact, when I arrived in Japan not long after, I remember I was in the car going to work and the man that was driving me, he saw that one of those trucks from the right just pulled in front of us and he said, "Oh no." And he got a little nervous, so I asked, "What's wrong?" "No, the ones in front of us." And I point with my finger. "Those?" He tells me, "Don't point with your finger." I say, Don't point with your finger." But we're in the car. What could they see? "No, those guys are worse than the Mafia." I asked, "Who are they?" "There's some crazy racists." I was like, I didn't hear anything else until I saw one of those trucks on the street one day. Recently, after hearing about this new conspiracy theory, I wanted to learn more. But anyway, moving on. Why are people afraid of the far right? Because the fact is, they're extremists. Obviously. The Mafia, for example, the Yakuza Mafia, for example, generally doesn't mess with civilians, and that's always been the case. In fact, if they're local mafias, usually the mafias weren't seen in a bad light, but sometimes they could even be respected people because they helped out with neighborhood and town events. Yes, people fear them, but not that much. The far right is much freer. Basically, they're considered crazy. Because if we look at the 1960 murder case, they already have a violent image. That young man was arrested, and moreover, he took his own life in prison. I mean, it's not like there was never any impunity, but the image of impunity they have is basically because they have political connections. But they're not politicians. They have mafia connections, but aren't the mafia. And the fact is that the problem is that they have an incorruptible ideology. Look, the Mafia, for example, doesn't necessarily have a fixed ideology. What they have are rules. What they have are objectives. They have their own thoughts, but it's not that they maintain an ideology with a goal. On the other hand, the far right has a very clear objective that they are fighting for. Constantly, supposedly. And of course, since they don't have specific rules, but they do have an ideology, it imposes a bit more fear. Because basically what they want is to go back to the old Japan. Basically Japan from the wartime era. I mean, imperialism, colonizing, whatever they want, however you want to see it. Their ideology is very dangerous, which makes it so scary. But let's see, how much is the far right actually achieving right now? Honestly, not much. because they're mainly focused on everything related to history, especially what happened during World War II. And what they want is to promote a high level of patriotism. And actually, Japan basically has no historical memory and is one of the least patriotic countries you can imagine. Look, the Japanese may have a certain pride, but the level of patriotism that the Japanese have doesn't come close to what, for example, Argentinians have. Knowing them. American patriotism. Nothing like that. It's like Japan is a country where people live in their own bubble. And fortunately, you can see it because, I'm telling you, there are few social conflicts thanks to the lack of historical memory and things like that. Well, let's see. Everyone can draw their own conclusions about whether having historical memory and patriotism is good or not. I talked about that in a very specific video some time ago. A lot of people criticize me, but well, that's my position. The truth is, I like it when people are calm. Now let's move on to the next topic, the Yakuza, the Japanese Mafia, the very famous one. What connection does it have with these two sides? Well, generally speaking, not much, but the Yakuza always maybe financed what it was. The far right, which has used it as muscle to violently fight the far left. I mean, they always went hand in hand to fight what would be communism. The Yakuza Mafia didn't like communism either, and they liked everything that romanticized the right. But look, what I want today is to focus a little more on another side of talking about the Mafias, because it was a few years ago, but I've already made a full video about the Yakuza Mafia, which I recommend watching. Today I want to look at some small changes that have happened in recent years. Many of you already know that the Mafia, the Japanese Yakuza, is in serious decline. Basically, in 2010, the law for the prevention of organized crime was passed, specifically targeting violent groups, which are called Boryokuden, violent organizations. Since then, life has been impossible for the Mafia, mainly because the Mafias here were organized. They were very formal and were registered as companies, so to speak. The thing is that the police already had in their files who the Mafias were, or who qualified as Boryokuden, as organized crime groups. And so, all the people who belonged to those companies, let's say, could no longer open bank accounts, couldn't get a phone line, couldn't rent properties. Basically, what they could do was just with what they already had. But they couldn't grow anymore. They couldn't make investments or anything like that. I've also recommended the movie Yakuza and Family, a Netflix original. Very good. It's a film that shows the changes the Mafia has undergone since the early 2000s until today. Well, let's see. Basically what the Yakuza can do now. Since it can't do absolutely anything, sometimes they pay completely clean people to act as frontmen for businesses they want to start. But even so, from the approximately 80,000 members they had in the 90s, now they have a quarter of that. I mean, it's said that there are about 20,000 members of the Yakuza today, officially. And of course, young people don't want to get involved in those things anymore because there's no benefit. Basically, if you become a member of the Yakuza nowadays, you're gonna have only problems. You won't be able to rent. You won't be able to buy anything. Basically, the only thing you can buy is whatever's at the supermarket. But clearly, young people, troublemakers are always around. It's not like the Mafia just disappears, and with it all, the bad people disappear too. In the past, the Mafia used groups of people called chimpira. And the fact is that these were like sub-mini organizations of people who did the Mafia's dirty work, rich, like they were running errands for this kind of people, but basically they respected the hierarchies. They had a small organization, but they were the ones who said, well, you're not officially part of our group, but we'll send you to beat people up or to kill someone. Because, of course, the Mafia family wants to stay clean, in quotes. These guys basically, they disappeared, but now there are new ones. They're called Hangure, which comes from Hanbung, meaning half, and Gure, gray, because it's said they're neither legal whites nor Yakuza blacks. They're kind of in between. Not legal, Not totally illegal, but obviously it's completely illegal. And the fact is that hangure are usually young gang members who don't respect any hierarchy. They're not organized, so they're very hard for the police to detect. That's why they're considered invisible. Mainly, they keep themselves busy with online scams, phone scams, and sometimes they also do jobs for the Mafia. I mean, they don't depend completely on the Mafia, but they can work with them. But they don't have any commitment or formal ties to the Mafia. That's why people say that hangure are now the real danger, because they don't care about the rules. They don't have codes like the Mafias do. They can just use violence for no reason if they feel like it. Hangure is basically a concept. It's not a group. It's not like there's a hangure who's friends with another hangure group. Maybe there is. Maybe there isn't. But you could simply be talking about a trend or a type of pattern among young criminals. And you might say, but no, couldn't you just call them criminals directly? And that's it? What happens is that the word furio exists. Furio means failure. When you say furiogen, it means a defective product, but there are people who are called furio. Furio just refers to rebellious kids who are up to some mischief, which ends up being some kind of crime, something illegal, like for example, hitting someone on the street for no reason. That would be a furiogen. It could be a simple criminal, or someone who is stealing or makes a habit of stealing things from stores, let's say. But the fact is that hangure, even though it's not a physical organization that's there, they are groups, and they do commit crimes. They can simply be different types of crimes, which sometimes can be big things, like drug trafficking, for example. The whole thing of scam chains. They can even get involved in trafficking people. Essentially, also, many chinpiras became hangure because they needed to cut official ties with the Yakuza, because it's also supposed to be a crime to have direct dealings or do business with the Mafias. So they broke away. And from there, you could say they were able to start working with whoever they wanted, and maybe not be loyal to just one clan. So Japan, at least, would be free from criminal organizations, right? Well, no, sir, that's not the case. Not at all. Wow, this place has a beautiful view. The fact is that it's precisely because the Yakuza is very weakened that allowed other mafias to come in, like the Chinese Mafia and the Nigerian Mafia, for example. They're the strongest ones in Tokyo, right? The Chinese Mafia is well established in Tokyo and Yokohama. And the Nigerian Mafia, I don't know if it's very big, I'm not sure. But mainly you can see it in everyday life on the streets of Kabukicho in Shinjuku. I've said it countless times. You have to be very careful with the Nigerians in Shinjuku, because while there are some who are connected to clubs to bring people in, which are legal, nowadays it's not worth taking the risk, because you don't know which one is involved in something legal and which one is leading you into a complete scam. They could drug you, steal all your money, max out your cards, and you could wake up on the street the next morning. But basically, as the Japanese Mafia is losing power, it's like the other Mafias are growing. The fact is, you also have to keep in mind that the Yakuza, even though they were never good, had their small good points, because they also had their own codes, and actually, the very codes they had are what caused their decline. By being registered, by being well connected with the police, all of that is what led to their end. They are in decline. On the other hand, foreign mafias come to do everything the Yakuza can no longer do. And even more, obviously, because of course the Yakuza was considered a necessary evil. But well, that necessary part is very broad and highly debatable, but the Nigerian and Chinese mafias don't have the same codes. It is different. Still, luckily in day-to-day life in Japan, there are no problems with the right, the left, or any mafia. Luckily, it's a completely peaceful country, in which, at least in daily life, you basically don't notice any problems from anyone. And that's good. But anyway, fun facts. I hope you enjoyed the video. See you next time. Greetings to you, your family, your pet, and your jerk neighbor. Did anyone understand anything? Because it was a complete mess, a soup of ideologies and stuff. But, well, it's not a history or political science class either, right?